Started. Welcome everyone. It's really lovely to see some familiar faces and a lot of people we haven't seen before. Welcome to what is I think the fourth installment of our SMS PhD chat sessions. Just to give you a little bit of background for those of you who are new, the idea here was to provide a forum, more or less casual forum for our PhD members of the SMS to get advice, feedback, input on topics that are of general interest to PhD students from faculty at various schools, and really just provide a forum to kind of document some of the kind of best practices or maybe okay practices that we're going to put out there. Of course, being organized by me, I had to do things ass backwards. So we started by looking at the people who were like really, really late stage. In fact, people who were graduating. And we talked about, the transition from a PhD into a faculty position. We then spent the last two sessions talking about being on the job market. And then, finally, Samina and I figured, well, it's about time we actually got to the starting crux of the matter and started to think about dissertation. So today we're going to be talking about really going back to the beginning and thinking about how do you go about planning your dissertation, how do you come up with a dissertation topic, how do you work on a dissertation, etc. And I'm delighted to have joining us today two people who in different ways and indirectly have been a really important part of my PhD journey. Anita McGahan from the University of Toronto, who has always been just an amazing guide, mentor to so many of us, and whose work really inspires, pretty much, actually still inspires the research questions I ask. So Anita, you want to say hi?
Well, thank you so much, Aseem. You always give me way too more credit than I'm due. Thank you.
And then Phanish Puranam from INSEAD, who, back when I was a PhD student, I think the single biggest piece of advice I got from my advisor was just do what Phanish did. Just look at what Phanish did. Just listen to what Phanish did. So pretty much, I think the first step towards working on a dissertation for me was, back at working was to go to the Van Pelt library, go into the stacks, find a copy of Phanish's dissertation and look at it to see what is this mystical thing called a dissertation that I'm supposed to be working on. And so it's really lovely to have you here, Phanish.
Thank you, Aseem. A real pleasure. I hope you found something interesting in the Van Pelt stacks.
Of course,
besides my dissertation.
It was quite depressing actually because, I knew I was never going to get there. So it was kind of like, oh man, this is like too hard a bar. But anyway, and then of course, it's always a delight to have joining me my increasingly caffeinated co-host, Samina Karim, who is just about awake enough to be on this call. Samina, you want to say hi?
Hi, everyone. And I am prepared with my caffeine, so we're good to go.
Good. Just checking. Okay, so just a couple of ground rules here. The way this is going to work is Samina and I have a set of questions prepared, mostly from suggestions that we got from you when you signed up and registered for this talk. So we're going to spend about 45 minutes to an hour just kind of discussing those questions, getting Phanish and Anita's kind of perspective on those questions. That part of the program is going to be recorded. So we are recording currently, and we will post that on the SMS website, where we also have posted the last three installments. And then at around the 45-minute, 1 hour mark, we'll stop recording and open it up for question and answers from all of you. So you can then ask whatever questions you have without being worried about being recorded or etc. Of course, you can also at any point feel free to add questions in chat, and we will kind of keep track of that and look back on them when we have a moment. Okay, so with that, let's get started. So I'm going to open it up by asking kind of the sort of basic question of picking a dissertation topic, which of course is a huge topic in and of itself. But Anita and Phanish, let me put it this way. In your view, what makes for a good dissertation topic? So how do you know you've got a good dissertation topic or not? And maybe Anita, you can start since you're not here.
Sure, thank you. A pleasure to be with you all today. Thank you very much for coming. It's quite remarkable that there are 71 people on this call. It's truly, I think, a testament to Aseem's and Samina's leadership that we're all together. So thank you very much for making this happen. So I don't know how you feel about this, Phanish, but I I don't know that you ever know that you have a good dissertation topic. I think what you want to do is find a dissertation topic that is meaningful to you personally, that reflects the journey that you're on, ideas, principles, um, uh, you know, kind of themes that have motivated you to pursue a PhD, that you find intrinsically interesting, that you think are important for the world to to reflect, for dissemination of these ideas into the world to occur. I think, other criteria for discerning whether or not you have a strong topic are, first of all, that it's theoretically important and that you can contribute to knowledge in theory, that it's empirically tractable and important. So you're looking at something that's empirically interesting. I, for example, um, I think somewhat infamously have said from time to time that I'm not very interested in helping companies sell more Doritos. What I'm interested in personally for myself are big, important problems such as artificial intelligence and machine learning, as Aseem was just describing in our pre-call, but also big, important phenomenological issues such as climate change and, the development of medicines to prevent future pandemics and infectious diseases and remediation of poverty and things like that. So working on something that's empirically and phenomenologically important. And then finally, I would say methodologically tractable. So you can actually identify a cause and effect. You can identify how a managerial intervention made a difference. So those would be, I think, for me, the major kind of considerations in picking a topic. It's intrinsically interesting and important to you. It's theoretically important and can constitute a contribution to knowledge. It's empirically and phenomenologically accessible and impactful. And then finally, it can guide practice and generate important and insightful foundations for action. Phanish, do you agree? What do you think?
No, very similar point of view. I think a search for a good dissertation is like any search process. It stops when you're tired. Okay, so I think it's like a search through a space in which there are, at least in my mind, these three dimensions. So there is the phenomenon, there is the set of theoretical ideas, and there's the dimension of methodology / data, right? So in the end, you've got to find something that sits at the intersection of these things, or rather in the landscape defined by these dimensions. And like any search process, as I said, there'll be some false steps, there'll be some peer-to-peer learning, there'll be some satisficing. Eventually, you'll come to a rest at some point and say, okay, this is doable. It ticks these boxes in terms of the phenomenon is interesting. I like the theories and the ideas that go with it. And I think I have the methodological skills and data needed to actually answer it compellingly, right? I'm actually okay with if your passion is to sell more Doritos, that's fine with me. I just hope for your sake that there are enough other people to share your passion. But regardless of what kind of topic you go for, I think it is going to be a search process in this very rugged landscape. And a realistic view of it is you're not going to find necessarily the global peak. We'll never know where it is, right? That's exactly Anita's point as well. But it has to be one that you are going to be excited about for at least the next 10 years. And I say 10 for a good reason. That's 4 to 5 in the program and another 4 to 5 to 10 years, because this is going to stay with you that long. So that's really probably the single most important criterion beyond the technical issues of does it meet the criteria of phenomenon, theory, and methods.
It's really
Samina, do you want to add something?
Well, I wanted to ask a question for Phanish and Anita, just continuing on this thread, which is, what advice do you give to students about, whether it's theory or data that comes first? How should they approach the initial tackling once they've identified an area that's of interest to them?
It's a very practical question you're asking, Samina, and I don't, as I said before, I don't think that there's a single answer. I think, many students will strive to find data as their starting point. They'll look for some information on that's accessible, something that they have let's say they have a second-year paper due, or third-year paper, a paper that's immediately after their comprehensive exams, and they'll think, oh my goodness, I only have, you know, a semester left. I've got to find a data set, and they'll go for some low-hanging fruit and then try to identify a question that hasn't been analyzed with some accessible data set, and, you know, wipe their forehead in relief that they didn't miss the deadline. So you know, to the extent possible, I would suggest not doing that. My recommendation would be to have a balance between these different areas of concern that Phanish and I have just described in approaching your dissertation topic, or I think perhaps even more materially, your first paper that you write, which will subsequently become a chapter of your dissertation, which is to say, you know, which is to have in advance some idea of what you're interested in, and some idea of what theoretical domain you want to contribute to. So instead of just looking for an opportunity to write any paper, I think the important thing to do is to look for an opportunity to write a paper and to contribute to knowledge in a domain that constitutes a piece of a bigger puzzle that you want to develop over the course of your, let's say, first 10 years in the career, including the doctoral program and your assistant professorship. What's the domain of ideas that you want to work in? I think of this as like painting a picture, and each individual project is like a piece of the puzzle where you have to, you know, really nail the methods, the empirics, the causal claims, the claims to knowledge. You want to make sure you're working on an important piece of a puzzle that constitutes a bigger picture on something important. And I suppose I do agree that that could even be about Doritos, although not for me. In other words, the point I'm trying to make by saying that I don't want to work on Doritos is I don't want any of you to work on your Doritos. In other words, the thing you're not interested in that's accessible because your dissertation advisor, let's say, has data on it, or a lot of people have studied it, so therefore there's well-developed public data sets, or whatever it is. You know, it's not so hard to develop new data. You can often, I see many of you here from institutions around the world, you can also find often find novel data sets in your country of origin. You can sometimes develop data sets by, you know, doing some sort of kind of creative investigation through, you know, examining a phenomenon carefully over a period of a couple of months, text analysis. There's lots of stuff that you can do by scraping data from the internet. You can do observational studies. Finding the data set and finding data is important, but I'm recommending that it's not the only criteria that you bring to that activity. You want to balance an understanding of where this is going to go in the future, theoretically, as well as methodologically and phenomenologically, with the accessibility criterion that often motivates some of our students anyway, in racing, you know, toward the opportunity to get there, to meet the paper requirement that comes for us in the end of the second year.
Yeah, I'd add that, you know, I think we've seen students at INSEAD who come in at different points into this place, right? So some come in saying, I'm already clear that I'm going to work on the phenomenon of CSR, for example, right? And some come in already saying that I'm really interested in theories of resource-based view or transaction cost economics or game theory or something. And there are others more, you know, engineering, physics type background people who already know about dynamic systems, and they're really keen to model stuff, but what they're going to model is not yet clear, that they're a bit agnostic on. And I think it's fine, right? In the end, they can come in from any one of these paths, but if they land on some point in this landscape that really makes them excited, and they think will keep them excited for a while, that's all that counts, I think.
Great, thank you so much. I guess I was also going to answer the question because Aseem posed it to me as well, which was, I was going to go back to the first one about how do you choose a topic? I know that I struggled. I thought I found a few topics only to find, wait, others have already looked at this. And sometimes that's a journey, right, that we all go through as early doctoral students. So don't be discouraged from that, I would say, right? Even though you start with the topic, as Anita mentioned and Phanish mentioned, there's usually a much larger landscape. So I think part of the choosing the topic is really looking at all the tangents around this larger map or landscape to find what hasn't been discovered yet. But I think it's a part of the journey to just first initially find things of interest, but then as you're reading more to find that, wait, some of this stuff maybe has been, there's a lot of literature out there, but usually there's some questions, there are many questions that are still unanswered. So, but Aseem, what do you think? Yeah.
I mean, I would add, I mean, I think, I think we all bring whatever metaphors from our research to these things, right? So Phanish is thinking about this as an NK landscape because he's Phanish. I'm going to think about this as like entrepreneurship and say, we have this long-standing and fairly stupid debate about discovery and creation in entrepreneurship, right? And I think that's relevant here because I don't think you find a good dissertation topic. I think in some sense, you create a good dissertation topic, at least in part, right? So, I mean, I don't think you should think about this as you're going to find the perfect topic that's going to be the perfect fit for you and that's going to work perfectly for everybody else. I mean, you might get lucky and stumble upon that, but it's unlikely, right? Most of the time, you're going to find often something that you're passionate about, and then you're going to figure out what's the audience that this really speaks to, what's the data that's available, and that's an iterative process. So, I mean, I think it's consistent with sort of what we've been saying all along, which is that, I mean, even when you think about what is a good data set is not a good data set because it's unique or because there's a lot of it. In fact, that's a really bad thing, right? If it's useless, then you're going to spend a lot of time cleaning it up and then it's not going to be used anything. It's a good data set if it allows you to answer a question that is of interest to you and of interest to other people in a way that hasn't been done before. And so you have to figure out why it's a good data set. I mean, so I think I get a lot of students who have quote unquote great data sets. And my first question is, okay, why is this a good data set? And if you can't answer that question, don't start there. But if you can answer that question, then that's great. I mean, to answer that question, you need to have a theory and you need to have a phenomenon to go back to Phanish's, dimensions. So I do want to, Anita, you mentioned advisors, and I do want to sort of push that angle a little bit further, right? So, I mean, so far we've been talking about this as a sort of solitary search almost, but so how does, I guess, so I know we had a question which said, kind of how do I think about the distinction between what I'm doing and how closely tied to this is it to what my advisor is doing? But I want to go a step backwards and say, okay, how do you even think about picking an advisor? What should one look for? How do we think about that?
Right. Did you want me to go first again, or?
Sure.
I'm happy for Phanish too.
No,
Phanish,
please go ahead.
You go first.
Either.
Okay.
Phanish, go ahead. Yeah.
Sure. So if the question is like, at what point do you fixate on an advisor? I think the answer is not too soon. I think it's a really bad news when people come into the program saying, I came in here to work with X or Y. I mean, it's good news in the sense it's nice to be liked by somebody, but it's not good news for the student. They really are not in a position to make that call until they've actually spent some time meeting multiple faculty members in the area and experimented with different working styles and interests. So the thing I try to tell students now is it's good to have your committee lined up soon, but not your advisor. So you need to have that set of 3 or 4 people that you're comfortable talking to. And at some point, you're going to anoint one of them as your primary advisor, but that doesn't have to come too soon. And as Aseem was alluding to, it's a two-sided matching process, right? They've got to want to work with you as well. And that takes time. And the beauty of our programs usually is that when the two-sided matching works well, it's fantastic. Okay, so you want to give it all the time it needs for that matching process to actually work. So that would be my advice, not to do it too soon.
It's fantastic advice, and I wish I had taken it, Phanish, when I got started. I lucked out, but without the benefit of that advice, I had a terrific advisor, someone who really cared about me and cared about my ideas. I think just a small point that I'd offer in the hope that it's helpful is that I think, you know, your expectations of what an advisor can do for you, you know, may need to develop a little bit to reflect both the advisor style and your own needs. This is not a traditional working supervisory relationship, even though sometimes your advisors call your supervisor. You shouldn't expect your supervisor, your main advisor, to tell you what to do, or to actually have a sort of well-charted path that you, by simply walking down, will be successful. In other words, what the supervisor's role is to, honestly, is to advise you, is to read your work, to react to it, to provide insight and guidance. But there isn't, one of the things that that you're doing when you're thinking about, you know, finding a good match for a supervisor is you're thinking about whose advice is going to help me, you know, actualize the ideas that I want to develop. So I wanted to put that out there. I've often had doctoral students come to me and say, tell me what to do and I'll do it. And I often, you know, I often have said to them, if I actually knew the answer to that question, you wouldn't have to do it. What we're in is the process of knowledge generation and discovery, and that's not something that's programmable, really. So you want someone who's going to provide you with, I think, support and guidance and access to resources and access to a kind of understanding of the process rather than concrete answers to specific questions.
Samina?
I think, you know, someone who has some interest in your pursuing the research question. So I don't think, you know, one thing we've said, this advisor doesn't have, and you have not yet maybe identified exactly who the advisor is going to be, but we alluded to the committee that you need these, you know, a village. It's, you know, we talk about it takes a village to also finish a PhD. So finding people who are supportive in your pursuit of your research question. They need not be the expert on that question necessarily. So I think finding that support system is important. And different people provide support in different ways. You know, I used to get emails at 2, 3 in the morning from my advisor, and maybe I didn't have weekly meetings. It was more sporadic. But when I did get that time, it was deep, you know, dives of, you know, 4 to 5 hours, or, you know, so everyone has a different style and a way of showing support. And I think it's just knowing that that person is there to direct you, like Anita and Phanish mentioned, to other resources. And they're, you know, they're very much more knowledgeable than we are when we're initially doctoral students, and know the landscape far better. And so I think that providing of that direction is what's useful, but again, not telling you what to do, but guiding you towards where you can expand your knowledge base more. And so I think that's, you're kind of collecting the pool of people. And it's actually, I think, the first time you're starting to do that for a journey where you're going to continue to do that through your entire career, collecting this village of folks who will support you in your search for knowledge, right? And that continues on. This is how, you know, Aseem alluded to, and I also think of Phanish and Anita in that village of, you know, advisors who've helped me along the way. And so that's how I would think about choosing an advisor. What about you, Aseem?
No, I think I agree with all that. I mean, I think the whole point is you are going to be the expert on your topic, right? So it's not your advisor, you are the expert. And I totally agree with Phanish that I think taking the time to figure out who your advisor is, also because I think there's a lot of I think the connection you have with this person matters a lot more in my mind than, you know, any specific expertise they bring. You have to trust this person. You have to kind of work with them. Different people have different work styles. So I think you really need this to be someone who you feel comfortable with, and you can only figure that out by interacting with them over time, right? You can't look at a letterhead and say, oh, like this is the senior most person in my department, so I want them to be my advisor. That's not gonna, that may be a terrible match and it may not work well. So I want to keep pushing on. Samina, do you want to ask the next question or?
Sure. So I think this is an important one also, is how should doctoral students think about how independent they need to be from their advisor is with respect to identity or the scope of their dissertation question? Anita, you want to take that one first?
Sure. So I think the question, I imagine that the question is motivated by a phenomenon in which the student becomes almost like an RA to the advisor, and the advisors got a well-crafted, sort of deeply and widely understood research identity that can subsume the student's agenda, and the student doesn't flourish because the student isn't separably understood and known on the market. Is that the phenomenon that you're worried about, Samina?
Exactly, partially that external maybe assessment of identity.
Yeah, I'm not as worried about the field's ability to separate the student from the advisor as I am from the supervisor's ability to let the student do what the student wants to do. So we have in our field, especially at the SMS, thanks to great leaders like Aseem and Samina, we have many ways in which doctoral students can present their ideas and can offer their identity for the community to start to interact with. And we support and develop and cultivate understandings in our field of differences between us. I think the real risk of this problem arising is in the structure of a school and the way in which a school, the university that you're attending, the way that universities, let's say, imposes on the student requirements to TA or to be a research assistant. And that leads to a dynamic where the student's interests are subordinated, and in a race to a finish line, the student executes a project under the wing of a faculty member, where the student doesn't have enough agency, enough independent control over the theory and the empirics and the phenomenological topic selection and so on. And so, there's a phenomenon at some schools, and, the four of us, Phanish, Aseem, Samina, and I, all four of us have variously been at schools that are large and developed, and perhaps a little bit smaller and with fewer resources. And there's a difference in the risk of this problem at both types of places that's a little bit different. At a smaller school where you have, let's say, only 1, 2, 3 active research faculty, and those faculty have a lot of responsibilities, their path of least resistance may be to treat doctoral students like RAs, and you need to kind of resist that. At large schools, you may have a dynamic among doctoral students that everybody wants somebody on their committee. Everybody wants to be working in a very cool area that a particular professor is known for. And you may get plugged into a system that can be equally problematic. So it's really, I think it's really a balancing act, and as is most of our career. But the key thing I think to avoid is a relationship with the supervisor where, you're always worried about the practical, getting over a practical finish line, practical concerns of getting over a finish line in a kind of manufacturing model of papers, where you're trying to stamp out papers on a particular schedule, as opposed to really doing the creative work that the papers are designed to enable.
Phanish?
I don't have that much more to add. I think it's a trade-off, because clearly if you work with an advisor who's doing, programmatic kind of line of work and is known for something, there is a risk that people don't see what's different about you. But on the positive side, you kind of enter the conversation at a very high note already, right? So you can kind of race to the frontier of what is to be learned much faster. You spend less time, I guess, on the dead ends. There are some things you can do to mitigate the problem, I think, right? So these are signals of independence. For instance, if typically you're doing like one solo authored paper and two co-authored with your committee, maybe with the advisor like this, you need to do two solo authored projects. Maybe you want to pick a phenomenon or a tool or a theoretical concept, which is quite different from what they're doing in one of your projects in their dissertation. So there are some signals one can kind of pick strategically to mitigate this to some extent, but I won't endorse it too strongly, right? In the end, you've got to do what makes you happy, and the market will figure it out. And I think given enough time, the market does sort. So in the early years, there can be an attribution error of thinking somebody is just somebody's RA, but given enough time, the quality signals do shine through. So you can tell who's really an independent thinker, who's not, but it takes a little bit of time. So, while I've just mentioned a couple of strategic things you could do, I'm very hesitant to say them because I don't think in the end they matter as much. If you are playing the long game, do good work and good things will happen, is what Dan Leventhal used to always keep telling us. And it's become something that I've come to believe in even more as I've aged in this profession.
Aseem, you want to add anything?
I mean, I think it connects back to the discussion we already had in the last question, right? An advisor who tells you what to do is not a good advisor, right? Because if all they want to do is get you to help them write the papers that they want to write, that's not the kind of person you want to be working with. I think you want to be working with the kind of person who helps you to write the kind of papers you want to write and do the work research you want to do. And as long as you're doing that, I wouldn't worry about the fact that it overlaps with what they happen to be doing. I think your independence will eventually come through. But if you're actually not independent, you're really just doing this because your advisors told you, that's not the right advisor for you to be working with. And you may want to actually think about working with someone else. Samina, you want to add something?
No, I think everyone gave a lot of great responses. Let's keep going. We've got great questions to ask.
So I think one of the questions that often comes up in this context, right? So sort of taking the metaphor of a journey, is the phenomenon of getting lost at the start of that journey, right? So I think we all kind of drift through our third years trying to figure out, because you make a transition from doing very structured coursework to suddenly you have to kind of figure out this very unstructured landscape if we stick with that. And so, what are some advice, some tips you have for how to approach this kind of unstructured task, and how to actually stay productive while you're doing this, especially going through, let's say, the third year, etc. And Phanish, maybe we'll start with you this time.
Sure. So one concrete thing I found helpful is rapid prototyping. So you have to be prepared to write many, many, many one-pagers, most of which will be shot down and ripped to shreds by your advisors. But that's the process, right? And the more of these you do and the faster you do them, the better for you. So eventually that's how you kind of converge on something that fits all those multiple criteria we spoke about earlier. But there's no substitute to a lot of exploration. And that process feels very frustrating because week after week you show up in your advisor's office and they seem polite and nice enough, but you leave with the shreds of your idea in your hand. But that's progress actually, right? Because every one of those meetings is shutting off a dead end. So if you think of it that way, I think it's actually progress. So that's what I found to be the single most important thing at that stage.
I just add that another huge opportunity as you finish your coursework is to develop a community of scholars with other doctoral students that you're talking to regularly, that you're using as sounding boards for your ideas, that you're discussing methods with, that you're connected to. So, I know most doctoral programs will encourage this, but really taking that seriously and thinking of these as your future colleagues and your long-term sort of network of supporters is, I think, a big opportunity that develops at about that time, the third year.
Samina, do you want to add something?
So, I think that third year is a critical time where you need to set some objectives or some guidelines for yourself about how you're going to be a scholar. Meaning, this is a profession where someone isn't going to tell you something is due at a certain time. You have to kind of be, self-propelled. And I think one of the hardest things is writing, right? Phanish mentioned a lot of iterative writing and prototyping. I think that for me, what helped staying productive was setting some deadlines for myself, because that's something that continues on in this profession. No one's going to set those deadlines for you. And it helps you to make you do those iterations. And especially for writing, I found early in the dissertation, and even third year, when you're kind of supposed to be weaning off of just reading other people's work and trying to develop your own, is set deadlines for when you should be writing, because otherwise you can read forever. And that's, I think, a trap that some third year students fall into. So staying productive is setting writing goals and deadlines for yourself. How about you, Aseem?
I mean, I would say, I agree with all that, obviously, but I also think, I think we overestimate productivity, right? I mean, or I guess we interpret productivity to mean tangible output. And I feel like part of the value of the third year is as Phanish was referring to, is the exploration, right? So, but it's not just that you're sort of weeding out potential dead ends. I think it's also that you're learning a lot about the landscape that may turn out to be useful later. Maybe there's not immediately a data set that you can use, right? So, you're doing this this is the only time in your career, believe me, that you're going to have the time to really just sit around reading things. So I kind of disagree with Samina. I think actually if you spend the entire third year just reading stuff, that's okay with me. Of course, I'm saying this because that's what I did, and I'm not sure you should follow my example. But I think, you're developing an understanding of the field, and you're developing an understanding of a phenomenon that, as long as you're doing it sincerely, will prove useful at some point, right? You may not find the perfect data set to test something today, but maybe 10 years from now, somebody else will find the perfect data set and come to you and say, hey, maybe a student of yours will come to you and say, hey, I have this cool data set that I just found. And you will say, oh, I've been thinking about this for 10 years now. Or, maybe you'll find a data set and you won't know what question to connect it to, but then 5 years from now, a question will occur to you and say, oh, I know that there's these data out there, right? So there's value in, I think, collecting this kind of overarching understanding of the phenomenon in the field that you're studying. And it's a rare opportunity to do that. So, don't panic if, of course, it's great if by the end of your third year, you have a beautifully written dissertation proposal and a really crisp version of what you're going to be doing for your dissertation. But I think if that doesn't happen, it's okay. As long as you feel like you learned something, that'll come back to be beneficial in the future. So I wouldn't stress about it that much. It's okay.
The hardest thing about this profession is enjoying it. At each step of the way.
Anita has this whole thing about how to enjoy. So Anita, you want to talk about that a little bit? I know that's not really a question, but yeah.
Let me put
it differently. It's not just about how do you stay productive, it's how do you stay happy and motivated and not drive yourself nuts in this profession.
Aseem is referring to a presentation that I gave at the last in-person academy session called How to Enjoy Being a Doctoral Student, which reflects this. Let me ask you, I wonder if you could put into the chat, why did you all enter your doctoral program? What drew you to want to be a professor? Can you please put 1 or 2 points in the chat? Samina, while folks are doing that, can I ask you why did you enter this profession? Why did you want to be a doctoral student?
Well, I guess I wanted in a sense, to be my own boss. And the pursuit of research was a way for me to be entrepreneurial, but still hopefully as a professor, get a steady paycheck. So,
steady paycheck while doing what you wanted.
Mm-hmm.
So intellectual freedom. Aseem?
I think similar. Also, I didn't want to work with people. So I wanted to kind of work by myself, and I wanted to have work-life balance. And so, it's like, okay, how do I do this and still do stuff that's exciting to me intellectually? Right?
Nice.
Academia was pretty much the only option.
Phanish, do you want to get in here?
It's quite similar to one of the responses I saw in the chat from Anil, who said it ensures regular learning. So, I enjoyed being a student. I was a good student, and I thought, imagine I could do this for the rest of my life.
Amazing. So it's wonderful to see what people are writing in the chat, and many people are writing along the same lines and talking about the stimulation of constant learning, the diversity of the ideas, the rigorous approach that we take, the idea of having an impact. Someone, Gregory has written, "I want to change the landscape." People are talking about meaningfulness and having sort of a meaningful impact, being on campus, having good quality of life, all these things. We don't have in the chat yet teaching, but many people enter the profession because they want to be educators. They want to understand something deeply. They don't want to move from topic to topic and so on. The problem with a doctoral program, the challenge associated with, for me anyway, with a doctoral program of enjoyment is that often you don't get to do these things immediately. In other words, you're not immediately an expert. You're in the process of acquiring the depth and the expertise. You don't yet have it. You're not known and renowned internationally for your expertise in a particular domain yet. You're in the process of acquiring that. And so it really tests you, a doctoral program, it tests the depth of your commitment to the reasons why you're doing this, because you're not actually experiencing yet as a doctoral student what you've written here in the chat. You do have some freedom. You do have access to ideas. You are invited to pursue your curiosity. Sometimes you may feel like you have almost too much freedom. I know many people feel awash in the third year when they've finished their coursework and they're like, oh my goodness, I'm going to get up. Every day I've gotten up for the last 2 months and tried to understand the same stinking paper, and when is this going to end? Am I spending my time the way I should be? So there's a lot of unsettledness in the dissertation phase as you develop expertise in these domains. The thing that for me, I recommend on how to enjoy being a doctoral student is to know the answer to this question that I've just asked and come back to it from time to time. In other words, if what you've written in the chat here is that you want freedom, you want independence, then one afternoon a week, read freely, get yourself off your own internal deadlines and pursue ideas freely. If what you've written here is that you want to have impact, one afternoon a week, read the business press or go and talk to practitioners or, get out of your office and go into the field. If what you've written here is you want to pursue abstract theory, once every one afternoon a week, at least make sure you're doing that. So the idea is to amplify access in the profession to the aspects of what motivates you. For me, I'm very phenomenologically oriented. So for me, what gives me energy and keeps me happy is, spending time with people who share those interests. Often it's doctoral students for me, but people who are, in the field as well. I've been very blessed by having, wonderful friends who are actually working in a practical sense on topics that I am doing my research on. And so going into the field and talking with them has been very valuable to me. The key is knowing which aspect of the profession is of greatest importance to you and pursuing that actively as you go through the more advanced years of your doctoral program.
Can I quickly add one thing, Aseem and Samina, which is the fact that I'm looking at, where people seem to be coming from in this conversation. I do want to point out that, our conversation might be anchored a little bit around the North American doctoral program model. And that is, widespread, and even the schools in Europe that I'm familiar with, like LBS and INSEAD. But there are other programs and other models, right? And I think it's important to acknowledge the pragmatic side to this, which is, for some people, the PhD is just a license to then begin to do what you really want to do, right? And you might want to treat it in some cases exactly in that instrumental fashion that, yes, it's got to be done. It's got to be done to a high standard of rigor, but all the self-actualization stuff happens later. So this is a license to get on the road to get there, right? And Anita was alluding to that, saying a lot of these motivators don't show up on your doorstep in the first year. And some programs actually make it very explicit. They're not expected to show up during your program. And that's okay, right? If that's the rules you're playing by, that's the rules you're playing by. But it's good to know that eventually that's where we're going. And having that ability to look at foreground and background is very helpful, I think.
This is nothing if not a long game.
Yeah, and I mean, just to build on that, I think also, again, I think we're coming at it from a very North American model where, you're basically sitting in you're primarily engaging with your department and your cohort, but I know there's, programs that are a lot more industry focused that, so we talked about, how to develop a topic, and we did mention phenomenon, but I think, again, I think there are programs where you engage a lot more with industry, and you might be, reaching out to people, talking to them, looking at a more practical problem where, you're hearing from your, people you're working with in the industry, they have this question that they're looking at, and that might be something that sort of motivates your dissertation. And I mean, even in our North American model, my colleague Andy Van would argue, his first question is, okay, who have you talked to about this in the industry, and why do they think it's an important problem or not, right? So in the spirit of engaged scholarship. So again, I think it's important that we sort of acknowledge the differences. But again, I think, so it is possible to start not with a theory and not with a data set, but with a phenomenon and a question that comes to you from practice that says, here's something we're really struggling with that's really kind of puzzling us, and then kind of build out, right? So again, you're starting from one of those three dimensions, and that might be a way to go. Okay, I am mindful of time. So Samina, maybe do we want to ask one last question and then maybe move on to question Q&A, or do you want to just open it up?
Let's ask one more, because Phanish turned a little also to this kind of pragmatism of, when you work with doctoral students, what do you see as the pros and cons of having a 3-chapter dissertation versus one single dissertation? What do you think are the pros and cons of those, and which do you suggest for your own doctoral students, and why?
So in my case, that's an easy one to answer. So I'm converted to the style of thinking that says the 3-chapter structure is the way to go. That's just responsive to the pragmatics of publication pressures, the need to have a productive pipeline. Also, I think the notion that we can write these big magnum opus dissertations is kind of ringing less and less true to me over time. I think as the state of our knowledge advances in the fields we study, it's really hard to make like a single big contribution on one giant idea. That's the romantic ideal. The reality is we're taking bite-sized, chunks out of a complex problem. And if you do those bites well, that to me is perfectly acceptable for a dissertation. So my default has become the 3-chapter dissertation structure.
Mine as well. There are some subfields where basically a single contribution to knowledge is a book-length project. For example, in sociology, where field work and qualitative analysis lead you to an outcome where you write one synthetic piece as your dissertation. But other than that, I'm in the same position as Phanish, that what we're trying to do is develop publishable units of work.
In pursuit of the LPU, the least publishable unit.
I don't know if it's least publishable. Maybe most publishable.
Most publishable. Smallest.
Aseem, what do you advise your students?
I think quite similar. I mean, I do think it's, again, I think from a identity perspective, obviously you want to make sure that those units have links between them. But I think the 3-chapter format just lends itself to I think it also helps with collaboration, right? Because it's hard. I mean, you really, it's going to be hard for you to do an entire thing by yourself, right? And as we just talked about, and so I think it's easier, but you can't collaborate on your entire dissertation with other people. So I think being able to do the bite-sized chunks, and then, you know, I mean, I think, frankly, most of my students are co-advised with other people. I really don't think I've ever advised someone just by myself, because I feel like it's useful to them have other perspectives. And I think often it's the case that, you know, one piece of that will be co-authored with me, one piece will be co-authored with somebody else on the committee or somebody else, and then, you know, one piece is their own. And so I think it just makes life easier. At the same time, I mean, I think, you know, if you really kind of, I think, I also think it's part of this accumulation process of, like, you know, you're going to discover things along the way, and often it's the case that those will become separate projects. So I mean, I honestly, I've never advised a one big thing dissertation. I don't know that I know how to do that. So that's also part of it, right? I mean, there are people who do like these big dissertations, they're not advised by me. So you know, it's hard for me to say you should do this when I don't know how to do it.
All right, super. I think we should dive into questions that participants have, so we have some time for that. Unless you want to ask anything else specific that you want recorded.
No, I think we're ready to, let's maybe turn off recording, and then we can sort of dive into some of these questions.